My name is Mary Burton, and I live in Cape Town and have done so for a very long time. I was born in Buenos Aires in Argentina, and I grew up there with my parents. My mother is Argentinian, my father was Uruguayan. Then I lived in Brazil for quite a few years too. And I had lots of different experiences in schooling. And then I had the opportunity to, after I left school, to study in Switzerland and in England for a while. And it was during that period when I was in Europe that I met my now husband now of a very long time. He was studying at London University, and we happened to meet as a student, young people, and we got to know each other. And then he came back to South Africa, and I returned to Brazil. But we went on corresponding in the days well before cell phones and emails, and only by long handwritten letters. And eventually I came to visit him, and we decided to get married. And the following year, 1961, I came to live as a newly married woman in South Africa, about which I knew very, very little. And my political education really began in South Africa. I made some friends, mostly through my husband's friends and their wives and so on. But there were things going on around in South Africa, that was 1961, that bothered me. And so I asked questions, and the questions seemed to make people very uncomfortable, and nobody seemed to be able to provide answers. And the other thing that was happening was that the Group Areas Act was being increasingly enforced. And there was I living in Rondebosch, and just down the road near the library and near the railway, families were being removed in terms of the Group Areas Act. And I then discovered the Black Sash. A group of Black Sash members were helping the residents of the areas in Rondebosch that were threatened with group areas removals to draft petitions among their neighbors with whom they had always lived peaceably and comfortably, to oppose the classification of that particular area as being about to be proclaimed for white persons' occupation only. And it was such a terrible thing to do to people, to move them from their homes. And it really struck hard at me. And it was that which led me into joining the Black Sash. And suddenly, here were white women, because the Black Sash was a white women's organization, but who were alert, who were interested, who were outraged at injustice, who helped me to study and understand the legislation. And suddenly, I was like a sponge, soaking up all this knowledge of terrible things, but at least I understood what was happening. And of course, that led me to ask more questions. And when I asked my new family, even, this is 1961, it was the year after Sharpeville. It was the year when there were protests in Cape Town. There were people being arrested all the time because of the pass laws. And the Black Sash was running an advice office, which was helping people who were affected by the pass laws. And it became clear to me that people lived comfortable, peaceful lives as white people in a society which they really didn't know or understand what was going on around them. And here was a small group of dedicated women who offered me an opportunity to learn. So that was the first thing that I just felt so hugely encouraged and supported by. And secondly, gave me an opportunity to protest. And so there the Black Sash stood with its traditional methods of protest and so on. When I raised issues like these on social occasions, inevitably they led to either an awkward silence or actually a hostile response. And at first, I didn't have the knowledge and the information to be able to argue with people. So I just tended to be silent and let it pass. But as I acquired more knowledge and more confidence, I would argue sometimes with people. And inevitably, that meant that we lost some friends. And my husband found himself drifting away from the people he had grown up with to some extent. And we had to be very diplomatic with our own family so as not to have family relationships break up and so on. And all that had to be handled a bit carefully, and I was probably a bit young and inexperienced in that area. And we discovered that people were, particularly women, because if they were married to a man who had a work permit, the man would have perhaps the right to be in Cape Town, but the wife would not. And so women were particularly vulnerable. And since many of them were obliged to find domestic work, they would be easy to catch on the way to and from work, picked up, arrested, and taken to the past court, which was in Langa. And they are given a very cursory 2 or 3 minute trial and sent back to the place they were supposed to have come from. It was such a terrible process that you couldn't believe that people who read these stories in the newspaper could turn their hearts against them. I'm thinking now of just recently passed away a wonderfully brave woman called Amy Thornton. And Amy Thornton discovered that there were a large number of women with babies being held in police cells, and that those babies had neither food nor nappies nor change of clothing. And she appealed to the Black Sash to do something about it. And there was an immediate scurrying around and rushing to the police station with milk and nappies and clothes for the babies and so on. And so women were conscientized through that process of discovering that they were real human beings just like them who were suffering these terrible injustices. And in those years, it did almost seem possible that if you could convince enough people, the laws could be changed. But everything continued to deteriorate. And so inevitably, we became more radical ourselves and more determined to act not just as a group of white women, which was very uncomfortable in many ways, because we had all the privileges that white people had. But we sought to open ourselves to working with other people. And the policy of the Black Sash had always been that we would act through, and I'm quoting our founding constitution of the Black Sash, that we would act through peaceful and legal means. And the time came eventually where the legal means part was too difficult to stick with. The laws were too cruel and too wrong. And I can remember very vividly a day probably in the early 80s, we held a public meeting in the Methodist Church in the Central Square in Cape Town. And we announced that we would no longer obey regulations about only one person can protest at a time. You can't have groups of people protesting and so on. And we walked out onto the cobblestones and held what was an illegal demonstration, which we knew perfectly well was illegal. And sure enough, the police came along, and there were a dozen of us or so. And it was really, in a way, quite funny, because the police came to fetch us in a little bus, and they arrested us very carefully without pushing us around, and put us in the little bus and took us off to Caledon Square, where we were fingerprinted and warned and so on, and then sent home. Well, a few days later, there was a mass demonstration in Berg Street, and we were part of that mass demonstration, and we were swept up in large numbers and all taken off again to Caledon Street. And one of the policemen said to me, "We were so nice to you the other day, and now here you are doing it again." So there was this extraordinary situation of being middle class, protected, safe, and white, and knowing that we probably would not be hurt in any way, and yet feeling determined that we had to stand alongside people who had a very different experience. And if I may, I'd like to tell the story about Leah Tutu, involved in one of these encounters, because I think it testifies to her leadership and courage. There had been a meeting in the Methodist Church in Caledon Street in District 6. And after I think it must have been an all-women's meeting. And afterwards, we processed illegally from the church down the road. And we hadn't got very far, of course, before we were arrested, 40, 50, 60 of us. Sheena Duncan, who was one of the national office bearers of the Black Sash, Mrs. Tutu, and a whole lot of other people, we were all taken off to Caledon Square. And there we were, these large numbers of people, of women, and the police actually didn't know what to do with us. We were taken down to the cells in Caledon Street Police Station, and there we sang and we danced and we did conga chains and we massaged one another's shoulders, and it was a real women's feast in the police station. And afterwards we heard that a message had gone through to Bishop's Court, where Archbishop Tutu was sitting holding a meeting in which my husband happened to be involved. And a messenger interrupted the meeting and said, "Archbishop, your wife and Mrs. Tutu are being held prisoner in the Caledon Street Police Station." So, of course, the Archbishop sent messages, and very soon the two of us were picked out from the women and told we could go home. And we said, no, we're not going home until everybody goes home. So gradually they finished fingerprinting everybody and taking photographs of everybody. And so we all left. But it was such an extraordinary sense of solidarity and friendship and standing up together against the injustice. And so I'm telling all these positive things. I mean, there were so many terrible things going on. And yet, at the same time, that experience of working with women across the Calabar, across maybe even political issues, but standing up together against injustice. And for me, that remained the criterion for such a long time. The important thing for activists who want to change a system is to identify what is wrong with the present system, but to have a vision of what needs to change and how it can be changed, so that there is a positive element that one is working towards, a better society that you can envisage, that should have just laws, that should give opportunities for all people to lead a decent life, which should share the wealth and the benefit of the country for the good of all. And so I think I can understand how disappointed and how angry the young generation feel about society today. And I long for them to build structures where they can work together towards building a better society, not only identifying what is wrong with the present system and opposing it in whatever way they can and wherever they are situated, but also looking towards a broader front of activism towards real change that makes real difference at the political level. And we have an opportunity now with elections coming up next year to think really hard about how we work together to bring about change, so that people have a vision of hope, a vision of a clear vision of what would be a better system, and are prepared to work towards it.